Alrighty, it is just past noon central, so hello everyone. I am Shrutika Yola. I wanted to thank you all for joining today's member webinar, Writing High Quality Abstracts, Insights from the Abstract Review Workgroup. We encourage questions to be asked throughout the presentation. As a courtesy to our presenters, all attendees have been muted. Please utilize the Zoom Q&A box for questions you may have throughout the presentation. The chat function is also available for discussion throughout the talk. Questions will be read aloud during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Today's learning objectives are: summarize the abstract workgroup process and criteria for reviewing abstracts, evaluate high-quality abstracts for their strengths, and identify practical tips for creating high-quality abstracts. Today, we are joined by Sarah Bannon, who will be introducing our speakers and moderating today's presentation. Sarah, take it away.
Thank you so much, Shrutika. It's a privilege and an honor to introduce our two speakers for today. So starting us off will be Sharon O Fox. Sharon graduated with a Master of Science degree in Human Genetics from Sarah Lawrence Genetic Counseling Program in 1996. Following graduation, she worked as a prenatal and pediatric genetic counselor, as well as a laboratory genetic counselor for Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and then as a prenatal genetic counselor for Rockford Memorial Hospital. Since 2002, Sharon has worked for Northwestern University. She worked for 18 years on a genetic biobank and was involved in several different related research projects, including the Northwestern site of the eMERGE network. Recently, she's been working on a gene discovery clinical study, including children with suspected genetic conditions, and is the assistant director of Northwestern University's graduate program in genetic counseling. Sharon has been actively involved in our genetic counseling professional societies, serving on many committees and task forces over the years, including being a past board of director and president of American Board of Genetic Counseling, past chair of the National Society of Genetic Counselors Research Special Interest Group, and currently a member of the JEMF Advisory Group and the immediate past chair of the Abstract Workgroup. Katie Lewis trained at the Johns Hopkins Genetic Counseling Training Program and currently works at the Center for Precision Health Research at the National Institutes of Health. Her research interests are the use of genomic sequencing in healthy and underrepresented populations, alternative service delivery models, and the social and behavioral outcomes of patients who receive secondary findings. She is the 2022 chair of the Abstract Review Workgroup through NSGC. So I would love to turn it over to Sharon.
Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. Just to reiterate our learning objectives today, which again is to summarize the Abstract Review Working Group process and our criteria for reviewing abstracts, to evaluate high quality abstracts for their strengths, and help you identify practical tips for creating high quality abstracts. We plan to spend some time talking a bit about the history of the abstract submission to the annual conference and the criteria that we use and to both process and review abstracts. And while much of what we talk about today is applicable to writing an abstract for most organizations or publications, we're actually going to specifically focus on specifically writing high quality abstracts for the NSGC annual conference. Next slide. So the goal of the abstract work group is to, one, encourage a wide range of research. We love to see genetic counseling and genetic counselors in, how research involving those in different ways, different collaborations. It doesn't have to be sort of what you may think of as in traditional areas involving genetic counseling and genetic counselors. And we also want to identify quality research that can be presented either in a poster or a platform presentation. Next slide. So the basic attributes of a quality abstract, most importantly, it should be well written with a clear message. It should be able to be understandable to anyone who reads it. Since, again, we're focusing on genetic counselors in our annual conference, it should be useful to genetic counselors and medical genetics practice, or comment on our profession in some novel way. It should include elements specified in our workgroup guidance, such as a description of a patient or family, if this is a case report or case series. And if it's an original research question, a description of the question specifically, methods, and results. What we don't want to see is an abstract that's already been submitted and accepted for presentation or publication at either another conference or a journal. It shouldn't have anticipated data, so we actually want to see the results in your abstract. And it shouldn't be an advertisement or promotion or marketing tool for a product or service. Next slide. Oh, thanks. So we have two kinds of abstract types. We have a case report, which describes a single family or patient, or a small series of patients or families that are related by genotype or phenotype or counseling issue. And then the original research that is based on a systematic investigation that will hopefully expand our knowledge relevant to how we practice genetic counseling or genomic medicine. For the case reports, when we look at those and when we evaluate those in the research abstract group, we want to make sure that they're novel, that they haven't been reported before, and how are they significant to the practice of genetic counseling. Again, there should be a clear description of the patient or the family or what it's being described. And then it should definitely have a discussion of why is this significant? Why should we care as genetic counselors? How does this impact our field or add knowledge to our field or practice? So for original research, it's also evaluated for the quality as well as novelty and generalizability, or if there's new insights into results or a topic, and again, how relevant it is to our profession and practice. Research can either be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative is often testing a hypothesis or describing findings, either an exploratory or pilot study. And qualitative is usually describing a previously unexplored topic or increase insight into a well-researched area. Usually qualitative research is not as generalizable or generalizable at all as quantitative, just because of the small sample size. The original elements, the essential elements that we look at in an original research abstract. Again, a clear statement of what it is that's being researched. Why is it being researched? Why should I, as a genetic counselor, care about your question and what you did? A clear discussion of the methodology, including how you identified the population for the research question. If there's anything unique or specific about the population that you did, or how you recruited them, or how you engaged them in the research study. Was it through a survey? Did you recruit them on Facebook? How did you find your population and get them to participate in your study? Making sure that the statistical analysis used is appropriate for the research question that you are asking. So again, quantitative research study is going to have a different type of statistical analysis than necessarily a qualitative that's going to talk more about the coding and thematic analysis process. There should be a clear presentation of the results. And again, the discussion should accurately reflect the results and their implications. Next slide. I do want to, actually, before I talk about this slide, I do want to point out that for those of you who may have been around for a few years and submitted abstracts in the past, we did used to have a category that was specific for professional issues. That was removed a few years ago. And so now if there's a professional issue focus abstract, or it should either be framed in an original research, so you're evaluating something that's related to professional issues and how you evaluated it, or it can be presented as a case conference or a case report or case series. There is no standalone area for professional issues. So the abstract review process, reviewers are trained through both recorded and in-person trainings, And these trainings and the schema or the rubric that's used was actually developed back in 2018 by a work group that looked at our review process to help make it more objective. And they're the ones who came up with this rubric and score cutoffs that are used. So that is what we train the reviewers on, are these scoring schemas. And reviewers are part of the work group for 3 years, which helps them become familiar and gain experience with reviewing. And after their 3-year term, they can certainly re-up for another term as well. Every abstract is scored by a minimum of 3 reviewers using this rubric that was developed. The rubric is meant to be a guide, and not a checklist for the reviewer to use. So because each abstract is going to be a little different, it's sort of how does the abstract apply to the rubric? And then the scores from each of those reviewers are averaged and then given a final score for the abstract. For some abstracts, they also receive a 4th or 5th review, especially if they have scores that are on a borderline for something, whether like a best abstract or a platform or poster presentation, or there's some red flag raised by a reviewer, either because they think it's a fantastic abstract and think it should be considered for our best abstract, or maybe there is a concern that it might be an advertisement and need additional reviews. Overall, once all the scores are finalized, the top 52 abstracts get a platform presentation, 2 of them being the best member and best student member abstract awards, and the rest become posters, and then some that score very low after below our cutoff are rejected. And now I'll turn it over to Katie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today, and to the organizers for giving us an opportunity to talk about this topic. I am going to be taking you through some examples of high quality abstracts and talking a little bit about what makes them high quality. So I've used actual abstracts from the 2021 submission cycle to give you a sense of what we look for as reviewers, and some potential good examples of things you might want to build into your own abstracts as you're rating for this cycle. The way I've structured this is that I'm going to base this all around those criteria that Sharon just outlined for the abstracts, and take each of them and show you an abstract and ask you to look for those specific elements and see how the authors of that abstract accomplished those goals particularly well, so we can talk about what it is the reviewers look for in practical terms. My goal with this is to just make it really transparent what it is we look for when we read abstracts, so that everyone can represent their data as best as possible, and their abstract can score as high as it possibly can. In this idea, what I'd love for you to do is submit your questions along the way into the chat, or to let us know if you have questions by contacting us individually afterwards. Our contact information is all of the guidance materials for the abstract submissions for this year, because we really do welcome your questions about this process and about what we look for, and are here to answer those. So for starters, I thought we would look at a case report. And what I did was take this notion of the description of the patient or family and the significance to the field, and operationalize it a little bit into this graphic. So on the left side of the graphic, you see the minimal criteria for what we'd want to look for in a case report, that there's a description of the patient or family that's fairly thorough, but maybe it's not that novel. All the way to the right-hand side, where you see the most impactful kind of case report, which is going to be a very thorough case description, and in addition, a transformative and relevant issue for most GCs. So that is sort of the sliding scale that we look at the case reports through. And here is an actual case report that scored very well in the 2021 cycle, focusing on a lung cancer case series from the NCI Li-Fraumeni syndrome cohort. I want to give you a few minutes to read this through and think about those criteria I just shared for a case report. Think about what they're doing well, what you notice that's exceptional about this case report, what makes it easy to identify those elements that I just mentioned. So the impact on the field, the clarity of the description of the case series, and note that down. And if along with that you have questions, please feel free to type those into the chat as we're going. We would love to talk about that at the end. As I said, we've built in a good bit of time for answering your questions because we really want this to be helpful to you. And then what I'll do in the subsequent slide is we'll look at this together and I'll kind of show my work on this and show you what I thought made this abstract really fit the bill for being exceptional. So I'm going to pause for 2 minutes to give you time to read. And actually, I'm seeing that nobody is actually watching this live due to a technical glitch. So what I'm going to do is instead of pausing for these times to let you read through, I'm going to assume that you're doing that on your own. And I'm just going to continue through with my review of this abstract. So when I think about what makes the description of this study particularly clear, one of the things that I notice first is this text that's highlighted in blue, that they've emphasized the number of individuals that they are screening as potentially eligible for the project, and they're specifying those eligibility criteria clearly to me. They're telling me these people have germline, pathogenic, or likely pathogenic TP53 variants. That is so helpful for understanding the context of these patients who end up being included in the case report series, right? Knowing where they came from and what was the eligibility criteria. That gives us a scope on, how we might utilize these data for drawing conclusions. The next thing they do is tell us very clearly what the source of the patients and the data is. And Sharon mentioned this in her slides, and I will emphasize it again. This is my second practical tip to you guys, is that so often we don't know where the patients or the families in case series come from. Was it an academic medical center? Was it a research study? Was it a support group? And that just really helps us have a sense of who these patients are and who the findings apply to most likely. So this study does this really clearly. They say it's a longitudinal family study, and the diagnoses were validated through medical records whenever possible. And then the case report goes on to describe the phenotypic characteristics of these individuals with great specificity. They're very clear about their outcomes of interest. They're using numeric values to describe this. So 28 individuals were diagnosed with 32 primary lung cancers at a median initial age of 49 years old. Great, that's giving me a good sense of who we're talking about, how big is the sample size, and how many of them had lung cancer. And one thing that they do that I'll tell you as a reviewer is really helpful is they add in this little sentence here about comparing the rate of lung cancer primaries in their cohort with the SEER data. That is so helpful because I don't have to go back out and pull that up. It tells me right away the significance of their results because it puts it in this broader context of population-based data that we have. That is incredibly helpful for starting to think about the impact and the reach of these results. And here is another excerpt from this same abstract. This one I really picked with the idea in mind of thinking about clearly stating the reach of a study. So thinking again about what is it specifically that these authors do that demonstrate that it's going to be relevant to the widest audience of genetic counselors possible, that show its novelty and how it will impact practice. As a reviewer, the first thing that pops out to me is the condition they're studying. It's a prevalent condition. I can imagine many genetic counselors caring for patients or families who are at risk for or have Li-Fraumeni syndrome across a variety of contexts. obviously, this is not something that you can change about your study, right? This is just going to be dependent on the families and the patients you have to study. But I think it does strengthen this particular abstract. The next thing they do is they point explicitly to the absence of data that would be relevant to GCs. So they say early onset lung cancer has been reported in case reports and as a general finding, but is understudied. That's really great. Again, as a reviewer, it cues me into where the gap is in the literature, and I can right away start to anticipate how the absence of that data affects clinical practice. We can't provide, the kind of risk assessment we might want to if a patient has questions about lung cancer risk, and we can't start to think about incorporating that into screening guidelines for affected individuals or for families if we don't know that data. So right away, I can see the implications of having more specific data on this topic. And then in their discussion, they circle back to that gap, and they tell you how they filled it. This represents the largest case series of lung cancer in LFS to date. And so they talk about the novelty of their sample size. This is a bigger sample than we've had in the past, so can more adequately address the question of how common lung cancer diagnoses are. And then they argue for the potential impact of their findings on future research. This idea that it lays the groundwork for more projects to start thinking about treatment approaches or screening approaches for lung cancer and Li-Fraumeni syndrome. Next, we're going to look at a couple of different abstracts that were original research abstracts. And again, I've just broken those criteria that we use as abstract reviewers and that Sharon reviewed at the beginning into chunks based on the pieces of the abstract they apply to. So the first one I want to talk about is justification and the statement of a research question. And again, I put these into a graphic to give you a sense of how we think about them. That an identifiable research question is sort of the minimal thing that we look for. Ideally, what we want to see is a clear and really strongly justified research question. And so here's a sample original research abstract for you to look at and think about whether the question is clear and strongly justified. And again, think about what these authors are doing that helps a reviewer be able to easily tap into that. Is this a strong justification for this project? And so if I show my own work, the first thing I notice about this abstract is that they devote these first three sentences to their background, which most of us would do. It's very targeted, and that's really helpful. It really leads right into what their research question is going to be. And I know that one of the main challenges that people write to us and talk to us about on the abstract working group is that word or character requirement for the abstracts, which I know is tight. I know it's really tough to get everything you want into your abstract. And I would say making the background as targeted as you can, thinking about what's really essential to the data that's going into your abstract is a way to work within that character limit and maybe cut some of the things that are interesting or that are relevant or that you would say if you were giving a talk, but you just don't have the room for in an abstract. This does this really well. They tell us exactly what's missing in the literature and where they're pulling that from, right? They tell us, I looked at the program websites. Most of them do not define what they mean by advocacy requirements. They provide examples rather than a definition, and they don't clarify what they want applicants to get from this experience. They're setting me up to anticipate that gap that's going to lead into a research question. And so the next few statements are that research question. What I like about this is they have one or two main objectives. And we really, again, this fits with that working in the character limit that, we want it to be a focused abstract. And I know that can be difficult if you've done a larger project, but thinking about those one or two main points that you really want to drive home, thinking about those central research questions and limiting yourself to just one or two is really critical. And then they go on to specify their study population. So again, getting back to where are these patients coming from? Where is your data coming from? It helps us get a context for your project, and is really relevant for us as we think about whether your results actually answer the question you posed, right? Not every population can answer every research question. And so we want to look for a match between those. The other thing that I'll say as a practical tip is that this abstract does a really great job of specifying their outcomes. And so many abstracts leave this vague. They would stop, if you take this abstract as an example, they would say something like, we wanted to gather data about programs advocacy experience, and stop there. And that leaves a reviewer saying, but what does that mean? What's advocacy experience? And what I love about this abstract is they tell you the advocacy experience requirements, why they have them, and how they evaluate them. So that specificity and outcomes is really helpful for us. And again, figuring out if your results really answer your research question. The next component of abstracts that I want to talk about are methods and results. And I couple these together because, of course, they go hand in hand, and it's really hard to assess one without the other. When it comes to methodology, what we're really looking for at a minimum is for you to describe your methods. Sometimes we know that abstracts have some details missing that we would like, or maybe the methods don't seem like an entirely appropriate match to the question, whereas the best written abstracts are going to show us clear, thorough, and appropriate methods, including a data analysis plan. And I'll talk about examples for both quantitative and qualitative research where this is concerned. I know one of the questions that we most frequently get is about qualitative research and how to represent it. What are we looking for? And so I'll talk through that example specifically in hopes that it answers some of your questions. When it comes to results, again, I think the minimal thing we're looking for are some limited results, some early findings. The strongest abstracts are going to present us with enough detail on results that we get a sense of whether they're generalizable and to which populations, or if it's a qualitative project, whether they're credible. So do they really represent what your participants told you? And are they transferable? Can we start to imagine how they apply to different situations? So here's a sample quantitative original research abstract that, again, scored very well in the 2021 cycle. This one has to do with the number of patients who have a variant detected based on whether they did or did not meet NCCN 2019 prostate cancer germline genetic testing criteria. And so I'm going to go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what I see when I'm reading this abstract that makes it a strong one. So for quantitative abstracts like this, the guidelines say we want to see clear, thorough, and appropriate methods. And I want to talk specifically about what it is the reviewers are trained to look for. So first, we want to understand your methodology for analysis and a clear definition of outcomes. I know I'm like a broken record saying this with your definition of outcomes, but it really is something that reviewers often comment on as a limitation. So the more clear you can be, the better. This project did a great job of that. Right away, they're defining what they're going to be looking for in terms of the incidence of pathogenic and likely pathogenic variants. And they're defining their two groups in the study really well, people who are in criteria and out of criteria based on the NCCN guidelines. That gives me a really clear idea of who they're comparing and what the major outcome is. They also talk in this abstract about their recruitment sources and a defined target population. And so again, is this patients being drawn from a support group, a medical center, a research study? Where do they come from? This is often a detail that's missing and leaves reviewers asking questions back to the authors of, where did these patients come from? Are they more likely to be more ill than the average patient I see? Are they more likely to be differently motivated than the average patient I see? That's why this context is so important, because it gives reviewers an idea about generalizability, about transferability of your results. And so this abstract is explicit about where these patients come from, a community and academic urology centers nationwide, that they're consecutive and unselected patients. That's really helpful too, having a sense of what your eligibility criteria are, if any, and how you apply them is really great. It just helps the reviewers breeze through these abstracts and rate them highly. And then a description of your data sources. Did you do surveys? Did you do interviews? Are you using medical records to review this information? If genetic testing was offered, what kind was it? Was it a panel? Did you sequence them? All of those details are really helpful and important and translate into an assessment that your methods were clear and thorough and appropriate. When we see your results, we want to get a sense of strong generalizability and that the results are thorough. And what we mean by that, again, is that the groups being compared or the patient population is well characterized. So we know who's included, who's excluded, important demographic or other characteristics of these patients, so we can understand who they are and how similar they might be to other patient populations. And then when the data is presented, we're looking for specifics about what you found. So the N's for numerators and for denominators is really helpful. This abstract gives us percentages as well, so we can make a really easy comparison between their groups. They give outcomes and significance of statistical tests. It's, again, something that reviewers really love to see is that specific detail, right? So some abstracts are written very vaguely, the majority of patients, or this was significant without giving a p-value or without telling us what statistical test was used. The more of that detail you can provide, the stronger the abstract is in our minds. Next, I have an example of a qualitative original research abstract, and this one had to do with factors impacting adolescent and young adult cancer patients' decision to pursue genetic counseling and testing. And again, I would encourage you to read through this and think about what particularly makes this strong. I think, as I said in the beginning, qualitative research and abstracts are a topic we get a lot of questions about in terms of the best ways to present them and convey them. And so I want to talk a little bit about this one, since it scored particularly well and what they did that fulfilled the reviewers' criteria. So one of the first things they do is, again, they describe their target population really well, just like we talked about in the case report and in the quantitative studies, talking about who it is that's eligible for this project, where do the patients come from, and their data sources, right? So this idea that they did these interviews, that the adult and young adult and adolescent cancer patients were interviewed, that they came from a genetic counseling appointment at a large academic cancer center. And then they talk about their methodology for analyzing the data. And this is something that we often find is missing in descriptions of qualitative projects, or that is very general and makes it hard to assess the methodology, that people will say something like, we coded our data, but maybe they don't tell you where that data came from. Was it a semi-structured interview? Was it open-ended text fields on a survey? That's really helpful. Or people will say, we analyzed our data, but they don't tell you about the approach that they used to their qualitative analysis, whether that was guided by theory or whether it was more open-ended. Maybe themes were emergent. How many coders did you have? Those kinds of details really help us assess qualitative projects and are important to us to see. Again, the data source and approach to analysis is really detailed here. It gives us a sense of what was done, where the data came from, and how they approached their analysis. And then they talk about specific results and themes identified. In this abstract, they list out the themes that they identified through their analyses. I think that's great. I think if you have the real estate using participants' own words as much as you can to describe and substantiate what you're claiming is great. That gives us a better sense of credibility of the findings, but I know is really difficult to do in a small abstract space. But I think it does help if you're able to fold that in and you have the room to do it. Similarly, if you don't have the room to do it, I think that you can also do other things to demonstrate that your results are likely credible. So if you did, for example, check back with participants and you provided them with some sort of summary of your findings and had them endorse that, that's great. Mentioning that in a brief sentence lets us know that you took that important methodological step, and it helps us evaluate your findings. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the discussion. So on the left, we see an underdeveloped discussion is sort of the minimal requirement in projects, all the way across to the strongest discussions, which argue for the strength of the study and the implications of the results. And so here's a sample abstract about remote clinical training for genetic counseling students that, again, ranked very highly in the 2021 cycle. And I want to read through this a little bit. I left in the results section so that you could evaluate the discussion a bit more and have a sense for how it is that they're translating their results into an argument for the significance of their findings. And so, in my opinion, what they're doing that's really useful is two things. So first, they make this statement here at the end of their results, which is the beginning of their discussion, that argues how the findings could be used in practice, right? This notion that, a hybrid model of supervision could be optimal for future genetic counseling clinical training. It's a great way to conclude their abstract and build on what they learned in their results. I would say that if I had to give a practical tip about this, discussions being underdeveloped is probably one of the most common things that the reviewers comment on as a weakness or a limitation of abstracts. And what I see them noting the most often is that a discussion is actually a restatement of the results rather than a conclusion about how the results can be applied to practice. And I will be the first to say I am guilty of doing this too. It's really hard to avoid doing that. It's tempting. And so I think this is where I use my co-authors to try to hold my feet to the fire and make me try to draw a conclusion. I think one way to do that is to, Sharon alluded to this in her part of the talk, ask yourself, so what? Read your results and ask yourself, what am I hoping that the average genetic counselor who hears this would do with this information? Do I hope they would, make this a factor that they consider in their practice? Do I think it's something that programs could consider in the training of students? Do I think that this is something that, needs further research? I would just think about what that next step is. Think about what the implications are and push yourself to comment on that rather than restating results. The other thing that this discussion does is point to the need for future research to extend their findings. And this is part of the balancing act of writing discussions that many of us find difficult. I'm probably preaching to the choir about this, but our guidelines say to not overstate your results. And I think that's important too, right? To not be claiming that, one small study can transform practice, that we need a lot of evidence to do that. And so often, calling for further research, pointing out what else is needed is a really helpful piece of the discussion as well. But arguing for how your research pushes that agenda forward, arguing for how it makes the next question that needs to be asked more specific or more tailored is a really useful approach. And I think this abstract did that really well. So I'm just going to talk quickly through some practical tips for submitting your abstracts, and then we'll wrap up. So in 2021, the first thing I want to emphasize to you is that almost every abstract was accepted. 94% of the abstracts that were submitted to the conference were accepted for presentation. Our process is not meant to result in a lot of rejections. We want to highlight high quality research and give people feedback, and most of the people who submit abstracts are doing great research, and we are really enthusiastic to accept them. This pie chart shows a breakdown of all the topical areas that we ask people to categorize their abstracts by. And I wanted to show this to you for really two reasons. One of which is to say, there's such a breadth of genetic counseling research that's coming out now. And so we really do take a broad lens about what counts as impactful for genetic counselors or medical geneticists. And we get a great diversity of submissions and are thrilled with that. And the other thing that I'll note is that we added a new category in 2021, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and got a really good number of abstracts submitted within that category. And so I would just encourage people to be aware of that. If you're somebody who's been submitting a while and the form feels familiar to you, that is something that's new and that we are encouraging people to use to get a sense for how many abstracts we get in that category. Sharon already touched on this. The only other thing is that professional issues is a abstract topical categorization. It's not its own submission type anymore, but if you do some original research or a case report series that is related to professional issues, you can still designate it as a topical area, as these 5% of abstract authors did. I think that other than the tips that I tried to point out in an abstract specific fashion as I was going along, other than those, what I would say is use the scoring schema to assess your abstract for the elements we review abstracts on. When you go to submit your abstract through the NSGC website, there is a guidance created by our abstract workgroup, and that schema is in the guidance. The schema that we use to evaluate abstracts is in that guidance. So hopefully you have a clear sense of what we're looking for. Our goal is not to make this a black box. We want you to know what we're looking for so that you can write the best abstract possible. And you can find that on the call for abstracts page right in the spot that I circled on this slide. As your writing, be as specific and detailed as possible, particularly regarding your outcomes, where your patients come from. Harmonize across the aspects of your abstract. What you say in your background should match your research question, and that should lead to your results. It should all tie in together and feel completely harmonized across. And I think that, again, that harmonization can help you work within the very small text limit that we offer by really focusing around that central research question. And lastly, I would say have your co-authors review your abstract prior to submission. I think that especially for students, we get so many high quality student written abstracts. It blows us away every year. And I think that I would encourage students as much as you can to use your thesis committee, use your co-authors to help you craft that abstract. If it's your first or even second or third time submitting, use them as much as you can. And I know many of you do that because I see what high quality abstracts we get from students. And so I know that you are actively working with your co-authors on that. And I'm just, again, blown away by that research. So I just want to end by thanking everyone so much for listening to this. The call for abstracts for this year's annual conference is live. So please consider submitting your abstract and your research. We would welcome it at the conference. The deadline to submit is May 17th. And if you have any questions at all about your submission, my and Sarah's contact information is below, and it's also in that guidance from the working group.
All righty. Well, thank you so much to Katie, to Sharon, and to Sarah for presenting today. This is the end of the webinar. We do sincerely apologize for the technology glitch that prevented attendees from viewing this webinar live, but we will be posting the live webinar ASAP. If you do have questions following today's webinar, we have added a survey link to the NSGC website to submit your questions. Our speakers will then review the questions and answers will be posted on the NSGC website in a timely manner. So on that note, on behalf of the NSGC webinar subcommittee, I do want to thank all of you for attending this webinar. Thank you again to our speakers for sharing their stories, experiences, and expertise. This webinar recording, again, will be posted to the webinar page ASAP. Have a great day.